All right, so here we go. And although we are in the middle of a lecture series, I assume that all of us are focused on the fact that Donald Trump was indicted at the beginning of the week for engaging in a conspiracy to try to overturn the results of the presidential election of 2020. And I do think while to interrupt what we are midst of doing to spend a little bit of time talking about this. And this is an issue of great urgency. It's also an issue I feel quite passionate about. And so I want to start for a moment talking about my stance in describing and analyzing the indictment and its likely implications for Donald Trump's future in the courtroom, but much more importantly, the future of American democracy, including but not limited to the presidential elections of 2024, in which Donald Trump remains the frontrunner Republican candidate for the presidency. So, my stance, and I want to try to be as clear as possible. I try in these lectures not to be partisan. You obviously will have gathered I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. You will have gathered that there are aspects of the politics of his successor, the policies in particular, that I have sympathy for and am happy have been passed. And there are other aspects of Joe Biden's presidency or the politics of the Democratic Party that I'm quite critical of. But when I turn to this indictment and the fact scenario that it's based on and the laws that it attempts to use to criminalize those facts, I am a partisan for the longstanding experiment in American constitutional democracy and for no particular political party. And I believe, on the one hand, that the indictment prepared by Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, and his team makes it crystal clear that Donald Trump is the most significant threat to American democracy faced, and then we can say in the last 130 years since the Civil War. And not only that, but the upcoming trial. We don't have a trial date yet, but it does appear that there will likely be a trial in 2024. And the effort to hold Donald Trump accountable for his concerted and energetic conspiracy to subvert the presidential elections of 2020 will be salutary for American democracy. It will be beneficial. It is one of the things I think that will prevent Donald Trump from becoming the next president of the United States. Having said that, I also think that in addition to the legal jeopardy that Donald Trump faces, in addition to the potential beneficial and healing aspects of this for our democracy, it poses serious threats, deepens some of the aspects of crisis for American democracy. And so I have a lot of territory to cover with you today. One more thing I will just note. Jack Smith, in presenting the indictment at his press conference, suggested that we read the indictment. The indictment is a little bit less than 50 pages long, a little bit less than 100 paragraphs. I would suggest that everyone read it. But having said that, I also recognize that not everybody has time or resources for this. And so I'm going to try to walk us through the aspects of the indictment that I believe are not most significant legally necessarily. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to take a stance on that, but that are most important politically and for American democracy, and most likely to become part of the public conversation surrounding Donald Trump and his bid to become president again. So that's where we're going today. A wide variety of topics to cover. I hope I will get through most of it. If not, I may have to take a second week to discuss this with you. But let's start with the legal jeopardy the former president Donald Trump currently faces, and you may be following the news. You may be aware that the sheriff of Fulton County, Georgia, has declared that certain roads around the courthouse will be closed on Monday. This seems to be preparatory for more legal action against the president. It's speculative, but it does appear that there will be a fourth major indictment of the president in the last 4 months, and that is in Georgia for election interference there. But he has been already indicted in Manhattan in March. I believe that trial is set to go to court in the early spring of 2024, March in particular. He has been charged in the documents case related to the retention of classified documents in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, and now Bedminster, New Jersey, and that in so doing, he's jeopardized the national security of the United States and participated in a criminal conspiracy to retain these documents and deceive the Department of Justice and the National Archive. And then just 5 days ago, the third and at this point final indictment was filed against him, made public, unsealed, and this is the inquiry into the effort to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. In all, so far, Donald Trump faces 70 counts. And this is not for this one case. The new case is actually parsimonious, and I might even say elegant in the sense that on the one hand, it brings only 4 new criminal counts against the former president, and those 4 counts have basically exactly the same fact scenarios, or at least highly overlapping fact scenarios supporting them. And at the same time that it's parsimonious and elegant, treats under the law the same facts supporting 4 separate criminal charges. It is also, I think, a very sturdy indictment in the sense that there are multiple interweaving fact scenarios, all related to the conspiracy to overturn the election. But one of the things I think we see is that Donald Trump was incredibly energetic, and his co-conspirators were quite innovative in exploring and then pursuing every viable avenue available to them to overturn the election. And to be as clear as possible, Jack Smith and his team only need to prove one of those fact scenarios in order to convict the president, insofar the former president, as insofar as I understand this. And so this appears to be a quite robust legal strategy. The first count is the conspiracy to defraud the United States. I'll go into this in more detail in just a moment. The second is the effort to obstruct the vote certification proceedings. And the third is the conspiracy to violate the civil rights of Americans, in particular, the equal right that every American has to have their vote counted, and in so doing, to influence the outcome of presidential elections. So to start with, let's go a little bit into the indictment and the supporting background. And the indictment, and I do want to read some of it to you, starts essentially substantively in paragraph 4, which states the 3 main counts. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant pursued unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results. And you may note I've omitted the also in that sentence because paragraph 3 of the indictment says that Donald Trump had legal means available to him to contest the results of the election and had a constitutional right to, under the First Amendment, a right of free speech, to lie about the outcomes of the election publicly and from the bully pulpit of the presidential podium. Having said that, right, it's a matter of ethics. We would hope that the president of the United States did not lie about a matter of such significance repeatedly and vociferously to the American public, giving rise to widespread belief in those lies. But that is his constitutionally protected right. What paragraphs 3 and 4 of this indictment do is to draw a bright, clear line between what the president was legally entitled to do, use the court system to bring allegations that there was voting fraud, that dead people voted, that people voted twice, that election machines had been hacked, and on the other hand, engaging in a criminal conspiracy to overturn the results of the election, not via the legally available means to contest the election, but via criminal conspiracy to violate the laws that are cited in the indictment, and in so doing to illegally overturn the results of the election. And so that first sentence with its contrast, that he did some things that were legal or at least constitutionally protected, but he also used illegal means, and in particular, once he had exhausted the legal means, once his in particular court cases have been thrown out again and again as lacking any evidentiary basis. And here's the phrase you're going to hear again and again as this trial proceeds: any basis for establishing that there was outcome determinative fraud. In other words, fraud in the voting process that was sufficient to change the outcome of the election. Court after court after court after court refused to uphold those allegations, often dismissed them as baseless. And then Donald Trump and his team of at least 6 co-conspirators turned to an illegal conspiracy, actually multiple illegal conspiracies. So in doing that, and we'll get into the details of those conspiracies in just a moment, the defendant perpetrated 3 criminal conspiracies: a conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government. Second, a conspiracy to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6th congressional proceeding at which the collected results of the presidential election are counted and certified. And I want to be as clear as possible. He's not being charged here with inciting a riot. He's not being charged with sedition, with a violent attack on the Capitol. He's only being charged with, and this will get us into the fact scenario, first of all, not using the power of the federal government to intervene, to prevent that protest from spiraling out of control into a mob invasion of the Capitol, in which people died, in which people were injured, and in which the possible life-threatening violence against the vice president, the speaker of the House, multiple elected members of Congress was a real and present danger, that rather than reacting, he deliberately delayed and used the fact of the insurrection, the invasion of the Capitol, as a pretext to continue to try to impede the registering of the outcome of the election in order to ultimately overturn the outcome of the election. Third count, a conspiracy against the right to vote and to have one's vote counted. This, I think, gets to really the heart of the threat of democracy, right? And the most obvious example of this is in Georgia, where he's probably about to be indicted for a fourth time. This is his phone call, which was recorded and transcribed to the Georgia Secretary of State, asking him to, quote, find 11,700 odd votes, either for him or to disqualify for his opponent, Joe Biden. And that this, it turns out, was one of many efforts to um, invalidate the legally cast and appropriately counted votes of American citizens, right? This is fundamental. Our right to equal protection under the law, enumerated at several points in the Constitution, includes a right to be treated as equal persons and to have equal influence in our elections. And that is only protected if each person who casts a legal ballot is counted as one and only one in the election in which they cast that ballot. What Donald Trump was doing, what his co-conspirators were doing, was trying to nullify ballots that were cast against him in order to change the outcome of the election. So this is really an attack on the heart of American democracy. This is then to continue. Each of these conspiracies, which built on the widespread mistrust the defendant was creating through pervasive and destabilizing lies about election fraud. That is not criminal, right? He can have pervasive and destabilizing lies. But when they are part of and contribute to a conspiracy, then it no longer is First Amendment speech. Targeted a bedrock function of the United States federal government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. So just to bring this home, the purpose of the conspiracy was to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to obstruct the federal government function by which those results are collected, counted, and certified. And I want to emphasize 2 points here. One of them is that if Donald Trump believed, and this will clearly be critical to his defense, that the 2020 election was being stolen through fraud, he clearly had a duty to do everything within his legal power to call this to the attention of the American people and to exhaust the legally available avenues to expose the fraud and to change the outcome of the election. That should not be contested. I will point out very quickly, in addition, that I am not presuming that Donald Trump is guilty. We are looking at only one side of the case right now, and he has a right, like every American has, to a fair trial, to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, and to be proven guilty according to the evidentiary standards of our law, which means that he has to be proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Having said all of that, I want to be as clear as possible. It's important that we respect those rights, not because Donald Trump necessarily deserves them, in the sense that he would clearly, in fact, conspire to, according to these allegations, violate the rights of his fellow citizens if it were in his power to do so. We nevertheless afford him these rights because we believe in the principles, not that he deserves it, but that every person in the United States deserves this. This is what makes us a country governed by the rule of law. It's what makes us a constitutional democracy. Jack Snyder, the great historian of authoritarianism at Yale University, pointed out that Donald Trump is not having his rights violated by being indicted, despite what he maintains. As a matter of fact, he is having his rights upheld, and that in other countries with a less robust system of legal protection, when you attempt a coup and fail, which is exactly what is being alleged, you do not get to remain free for 2.5 years, organize another presidential campaign, and continue to fundraise in order to be able to use your supporters' donations to fund your legal defense. You face often a court martial and then a firing squad, right? And so Donald Trump deserves, because we believe in the rule of law and constitutional democracy, not to be presumed guilty. But the allegations in this indictment are supported by a wide body of evidence that we, as the people of the United States, have a right to discuss and consider in evaluating his qualification and suitability to be the next president of the United States, a position he is seeking, right? And so that's, I want to be as clear as possible about the way in which we should be viewing this document at this moment. Now, very quickly, the document does not list the 6 co-conspirators. And I think it does so for a couple reasons. One of them is because if it had listed and indicted the 6 co-conspirators, then Donald Trump's trial would be entangled with their trials and defenses, and that would have slowed the whole process down. And Jack Smith, as a former prosecutor for the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, understands that in prosecuting a head of state, it's important to be expeditious. It's important in particular to weigh political factors, and that in this case, if Donald Trump is elected president before this case goes to trial and a verdict is reached, he will undoubtedly subvert the trial, right? So disentangle his case from these other 6 individuals in order to get him to trial in the middle of the presidential election, as opposed to having the trial scuttled after the presidential election. But second of all, the fact that these 6 have not yet been charged creates pressure on them to cooperate with Smith's investigation and trial in order to avoid going to jail themselves. We'll have to see if Smith actually offers them that, if they actually take him up, because it appears to me that Smith's case is quite tight, and by the way, is built on the testimony of Trump's former vice president, Trump's attorney general, Trump's chief of staff, perhaps also Trump's own children, right? And so these are people who clearly supported Trump up until he started trying to use the power vested in his office to overturn the results of an election. And at that point, most of the decent people around him got off that train. It's only these 6 individuals, and perhaps some others, who began to assist him. And please note, with the exception of Jeffrey Clark, none of these people worked for the federal government, for the White House. This, by the way, is Boris Epstein. It wasn't known at the time that this document was created, but it does appear clear based on the document that we can identify all 6. So those are the allegations and the gravity of the allegations. This is the actual indication of how this conspiracy unfolded. And I'll be relatively brief, but I do want to go through this, right? This federal government function, from the point of view of ascertainment to certification, right? Ascertaining and certifying the outcome of a presidential election is foundational to the United States democratic process, and until 2021 had operated in a peaceful and orderly manner for more than 130 years. And so what we're talking about, of course, is the last time this didn't function was during the Civil War. Manner and means. And here we have five different fact scenarios, and I believe that the evidence for each is considerable and hard to gainsay. But having said that, remember that probably the prosecution only needs to prove one, whereas Donald Trump and his defense team need to disprove all five. The defendant and co-conspirators, this is the first, used knowingly false claims of election fraud to get state legislatures and election officials to subvert the legitimate election results and change electoral votes for the defendant's opponent, Biden, to electoral votes for the defendant, Trump, right? And so this is the efforts to have hearings in Pennsylvania, for instance, and so those are elected state legislatures trying to change the outcome of the election, or to work the election officials like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia to change the outcome of the election. And it turns out that Trump and his co-conspirators did this in multiple states simultaneously. Second, the defendant and the co-conspirators organized fraudulent slates of electors in 7 targeted states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, attempting to mimic the procedures that the legitimate electors were supposed to follow under the Constitution and other federal and state laws. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? One of the things that this brings out is that the Election Certification Act of 1876 creates all of these choke points, all of these vulnerabilities for someone who determinedly sets out to overturn the results of an election. And that it is the case that this constitutional lawyer, John Eastman, who had researched this, identified for Trump, look, we can attempt to use the state legislatures who have to certify the results, but we can also attempt to use the actual certification of the electors to change the results. In a well-functioning democracy, we would be looking at this and saying, this legislation needs updating and fixing. It's way too rickety a legal system that we have in place to certify the results of our most important elections. That's not going to happen. But at least the public is going to have some awareness that there are all of these vulnerabilities. Now, to turn to the second fact scenario, I have an analogy that I'll share with you very quickly. This is like somebody trying to steal your home by generating a fake title certificate and actually looking at, let's say it's the county clerk who certifies the title, looking at their seal and then making a copy of that seal and then producing an alternative title and then trying to get that alternative title filed with the county so that they can then go to court and say, see, I have the legitimate title to the house, not them, right? Then and this is one of those places where fraudulent deceit is not just lying about the election results, but saying to the alternative electors, we will only use the documents we're having you produce and sign if courts determine that the other slate of electors, the legitimate legal slate of electors, is there only because fraud, right? Electoral fraud. But having said that, they nevertheless, at least so it's alleged, used their documents, despite the fact that the courts threw out all of those allegations, right? So they're lying even in a sense to their co-conspirators. Third fact scenario, the defendant and the conspirators attempted to use the power and authority of the Justice Department to conduct sham election crime investigations and to send a letter to the targeted states that falsely claimed that the Justice Department had identified significant concerns that may have impacted the election outcome. And here now the spotlight shifts to Jeffrey Clark, who is ironically the acting associate director of the Department of Justice for Civil Rights, and who, with the help of Eastman, identifies this strategy, will send letters from the Department of Justice to the states in question, telling them that they have fraud in their states and the Justice Department doesn't think that the outcome that they've certified is the correct outcome. And of course, everybody else at the Justice Department said, no, you can't do that to Jeffrey Clark because there's no evidence. And you can't send letters saying we have evidence if we don't have evidence. At which point, Donald Trump considered firing the acting director of the Department of Justice, right? Barr had already resigned. And so there was just an acting director in order to appoint Jeffrey Clark to be the new acting director. So nobody could prevent him from sending these fraudulent letters to the state. And at that point, the entire Department of Justice said they would resign rather than allowing Trump to do this. And again, I want to be as clear as possible. I'm not per se trying to judge Trump and his co-conspirators or alleged co-conspirators' guilt. What I'm trying to do is to indicate to you what will be playing out in a court of law, which, if the special counsel and the Department of Justice have their preferred schedule in place in the summer of 2024, in the buildup to a presidential election, many Americans are going to see that the former president, the current candidate for president of the United States, used the Justice Department, or at least tried to undermine the results of an election by getting it to amplify his lies. And I think the question that this poses is if the former president was willing to do this in his last months in office, if in his last months in office he figured out, I need to appoint somebody to the head of the Justice Department who will just do whatever the hell I tell them to do, including amplifying my lies, using the Department of Justice's credibility to impose the lies on the states. Won't he try to do that in his first month in office if he's reelected? And he'll have a lot more time, a lot more experience, a lot more capacity to weaponize, instrumentalize, and subvert the institutions that enforce the rule of law in our country. Fourth factual allegation. The defendant and co-conspirators attempted to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the January 6th certification proceedings to fraudulently alter the election results. And I'm not going to go through this. I don't have time, but I would strongly encourage you to read, I believe it's paragraphs 90 through 99 of the indictment, which document in great detail, drawing on Mike Pence's contemporaneous notes, the nature of this pressure campaign, that it was unrelenting, that it was bullying and intimidating, and that Trump was unwilling to hear from the vice president that his role, which is essentially gavel in, certify, gavel out, ceremonial, that he should use that role to say, we will not certify these results. We need to throw them to the House of Representatives. That this was one of the avenues of the conspiracy. And this is one place where Mike Pence showed his mettle and his compass and said, no, I'm not going to do this. And this, of course, led to the famous declaration by Donald Trump, or the soon to be famous declaration, "You're too honest," which, by the way, is now Mike Pence's campaign slogan on his merch, "Too honest," right? And we'll get to this, but among other things, that means that Trump admitted in the process of trying to bully Pence into doing his dirty work that he knew he was being dishonest. Uh, Fifth and final, after it became public on the afternoon of January 6th that the vice president would not fraudulently alter the election result, a large and angry crowd uh, violently attacked the Capitol and halted the proceeding, the certification of the election. As violence ensued, the defendant and co-conspirators exploited the disruption by redoubling efforts to levy false claims of election fraud and convince members of Congress to further delay the certification based on those claims. And this, I think, is one of the places where the legal strategy seems to me to be very smart. Don't charge Trump with inciting violence or sedition. Go for the much more clear-cut fact. We don't know for sure what his intention was in what he said in that speech on the ellipse, but what we do know is that he didn't do anything to get the mob to disband for hours. And while he was, in essence, not taking, right, the most important elected officials other than him in the United States out of harm's way, he was simultaneously calling them and trying to get them to use the riot as pretext for not certifying the results of the election. He was taking to Twitter to try to continue to indicate that Mike Pence should change the results of the election. I'm going to be briefer about this because I do want to get into other things, but one of the critical elements of this case is going to be whether or not Donald Trump was knowingly lying about the outcome of the election he lost. And here I just want to point out again the thoroughness of the indictment in documenting all the people who told Trump that he was wrong, right? The vice president, the senior leaders of the Justice Department, including the Attorney General, the Director of National Intelligence, the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the senior White House attorneys, all said to him, this is not true. And they said it to him repeatedly as the courts were also throwing out these cases as baseless, right? And so at this point, you have to ask, what kind of person continues to believe what an entire apparatus of government designed to give him the best and most reliable information in the world? What kind of person continues to believe their own story as opposed to what is being delivered to them, continues to believe what people, and please note that Donald Trump himself said that Sidney Powell struck him as crazy, but then went out in public and said what Sidney Powell says is true and disregarded all of this information. So this will, it seems to me, be one of the most interesting aspects of the case, right? That the idea that these were deliberate lies. It wasn't just that Donald Trump believed this and therefore had a right to say it. That is not in contest, that he had a right to say it, even if he didn't believe it, but that he was lying and that these lies were part of a conspiracy. The state of mind of Donald Trump may be among the most difficult of the elements of the case to prove. Um, and it also is the element most likely to trigger First Amendment concerns. But having said that, I want to point out that the indictment has some quite damning information in it, and I imagine the trial will have still more, right? So when Trump says, "You're too honest," or "You're too damn honest," to Mike Pence on the 1st of July, sorry, wrong year, 2021, um, there's an implicit acknowledgement that Trump is lying and that he's asking Pence to act on the basis of the lies. And I imagine this will be one of several illustrations. And then Jason Miller, one of the co-conspirators, says in a communication, it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. And so what the prosecution will seek to prove is that Trump is a very good liar. And they will have plenty of evidence to back them up, assuming that Trump takes the stand. But even if he doesn't, they'll be able to point out that on the very same week, in documents filed to his creditors, he listed the value of a property as one figure, and then when he files for taxes, an entirely different figure, orders of magnitudes of difference. And so the question will be, did the value of the property change that much in a week? Or aren't you just saying one thing to one and another thing to another because it's in your interest to do so? And that'll just be the tip of the iceberg. There are estimates that there are days when Trump was in the White House where he lied more than 100 times in a day, right? Set the record as far as impartial fact checkers are concerned for the most lies in the White House in a 4-year period. This is going to uh, come out and be an incredibly important part of the case. That the fact that Trump maintains that he really believed this is just going to go to demonstrate that he will not surrender a lie once he latches onto it. Now, outside of the courtroom, Trump is going to defend himself primarily in the court of public opinion. And this is where he seems to have banked on succeeding. If he can win the presidency, he can pardon himself, perhaps dismiss the prosecutor if the case has not been resolved, or if he's still caught up in appeals. And so that's the best way for him to get out from under this. He will do this, defend himself, in part by trying to attack the justice system and our ability to believe that it impartially enforces the rule of law. He'll do this with so-called whatsaboutism. What about Hunter Biden and what he did on his taxes, or with his gun, or with Burisma in the Ukraine? Everybody is as corrupt as I am, and they're prosecuting me now only because my rival fears that I'm going to defeat them in the election. And this will suggest to his followers, to the people who believe him, that the criminal justice system is corrupt and not to be trusted, that the central institution for enforcing the rule of law in our society no longer is an instrument for the rule of law, but a partisan instrument of persecution. Whether this will succeed depends on what happens in public opinion, not on what happens in the court of law, because now we're talking about the trial by public opinion. I'm going to look at that opinion in a moment, and I'm going to suggest to you that I do not believe it will succeed. That, as a matter of fact, I believe that Trump has probably hit a ceiling of support, and that the possibility for gaining the additional support he would need to win the presidency is going to be directly undermined by what is learned in the process of these trials. And so, having said that, public opinion is, of course, unpredictable. There's no way to know for sure. And this, of course, is a two-person race. Should things come out about Joe Biden that further undermines his popularity, his credibility, his standing, I don't want to predict what will happen. But I do believe that nothing will come out about Joe Biden that suggests that he committed or participated in a criminal conspiracy to change the outcome of a presidential election. And so, though people may not be in love with Joe Biden, they're not going to have the same fear and reason for withdrawing support from him. So, there's a difficulty facing Donald Trump. I believe if you were the lawyer of somebody facing 3 or 4 separate trials, at least 70 counts in 4 different jurisdictions with 4 different judges and attorneys, and in particular juries, you would tell your client, clear the decks. This is going to take all of your attention, all of your time. You're going to have to be coached to be an effective witness. You're going to have to assist with your defense. This is going to be incredibly arduous and difficult. Please don't do anything else. And of course, Donald Trump is trying to run for the presidency of the United States at the same time. He's literally going to have a difficult time being in the places he needs to be, in court, in New York, in Florida, in Georgia, in DC, while running in 50 states in primaries, and then if he is the candidate in the general election. Having said all of that, so this is going to strain Donald Trump. It's probably going to make his legal defense less competent than it should or could be in order to concentrate on the defense in public opinion. He is not only putting himself in jeopardy, he is no doubt going to jeopardize many major American institutions. The rule of law, as I've already mentioned, and concomitant with that, the justice system. More generally, constitutional democracy seems to me to be clearly in crisis already. We have such high levels of polarization, partisan animosity, mistrust, and lack of common information that it's very difficult to conduct elections that settle our political disputes or that constructively channel them into deliberation. And then finally, and I want to be as clear as possible, I think it's very likely that the Republican Party is going to be deeply damaged by this, and that ultimately that may be good for American democracy. The Republican Party has become a highly destructive vehicle for the amplification of propaganda and disinformation over the period in which it's become the party of Donald Trump, arguably going back to the Tea Party, right? The Tea Party movement in 2010. Um, Having said that, I don't think we should be complacent or blasé about the fact that when in a constitutional democracy, one of the two main parties goes through a structural crisis, that's easy to navigate. This is going to be a very difficult period for American democracy. The final casualty here, and it's directly related, is the idea that the legal system might serve as an institution to impartially arbitrate our disputes of fact when they are legally relevant, right? So we may not agree, but if we go to the court and the court issues its verdict, at least for legal purposes, we treat that issue as being resolved. And that actually is an incredibly important rudder in a constitutional democracy to keep our political disputes and their factual basis within the bounds of the rule of law and hopefully some degree of civility. So having said all of that, I will turn to the court of public opinion. I want to start, and what I'm about to show you is that over a third of the Republican Party is likely to believe Donald Trump and believe him more or less no matter what he says, and to support him even if he is convicted of a conspiracy to try to overturn the results of a presidential election. And I think we should have some sympathy for those people. Right. And so I'm calling this sympathy for the devil with a little bit of a shout out to the Rolling Stones. I want to say that Trump's lies are believed and effective because he attacks liberal institutions, liberal in the 19th century sense of that term, and liberal elites in the 21st century political sense of that term, that many of his supporters have reasonably concluded are stacked against them, the institutions as well as the individuals, and that he can parlay attacks on him as attacks on this large group of Americans who feel that they've been left out of wealth creation, disrespected, disregarded, and therefore are suffering from status insecurity and are inclined to an illiberalism already, to no longer believe that the institutions of respecting the rights of minorities, of the rule of law, are worthy of support because they benefit everyone equally. And in a sense, they have a point. The system has been stacked against them or rigged for much of the last 50 years. This means that when Trump says, I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those of you who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. They believe him. They are rooting for him to perhaps even tear down the systems that they believe are so rigged against him. In a previous talk on this, I've said the illegality is the point, that Trump is, in a sense, saying we should not respect these institutions, even the rule of law, if their effect over the long term is to take your wealth, your security, your standing, and transfer it to those who already are doing very well, rendering you precarious. And so I'm not going to dwell on this point. When I turn to public opinion, I just want you to have it in the back of your mind that if we're not just going to hopefully discredit Donald Trump for having tried to commit a criminal fraud to overturn the results of an election, but also to fix the problems in our democracy that make someone like Trump possible and popular in the first place. We have to recognize why there is support for him, even in light of the coming to uh, light of these allegations. So very quickly to go through the public opinion now, because I do think that this is where the fundamental battle is going to play out. This is a poll from July. So this is almost all of these polls. I believe actually all of these polls are conducted before the indictment came out. But in the middle of July, what are the most serious allegations against Trump? Um, the conspiracy to overturn the election. 71% of Americans thinks that that's a serious allegation. Attempting to obstruct the certification of the election, almost 70%. It's really hard to get 70% of Americans to agree on anything, and yet they agree that this is serious. In the middle of June, when asked, what do you think Trump's biggest legal vulnerability is, Americans said the classified documents case at Mar-a-Lago, followed by the events of January 6th. But I want to be as clear as possible. When you phrase the question on a poll in that way, I think most people think of inciting violence or sedition, not of conspiring to overturn an election and using the mob as a way of doing that. So I suspect that as the indictment gets more attention, as more people are exposed to the information it contains, in particular when the trial actually unfolds and many of Trump's staff and supporters are on the witness stand saying that this is what Trump did, that this is going to rise to being much more important. The next question, how is Trump doing politically? And two things to note here. He is trouncing his opponents for the Republican Party nomination, right? It's 70% of Republicans currently support him. His next rival, Ron DeSantis, has around 20%. One way to put this is that there are more Republicans who would continue to support Trump, even if convicted of a federal crime, than support Ron DeSantis, period, the end. And when it comes to Biden and Trump neck to neck, head to head, this is essentially a tie at this moment. And I think that's distressing for many people who take at face value the good work that Jack Smith has done and the allegations against the president. But I would point out to you, I don't see the number of people who support Trump getting much higher than this. And so Trump probably has hit a ceiling, and that's in part because if you look at core Republican base voters, people who are Republican are likely to vote Republican, yes, 37% of them, more than a third, say that they will support Trump no matter what. But 25% of them, fully a quarter of the Republican base, say that there is no way that they will support Trump. And the other 37% say that they are persuadable either way. This is not of American voters. This is of the Republican base. And I suspect what that means is that a significant portion of these voters are likely to end up opposed to Trump. That does not mean that they will support Biden, but it does mean that Trump has a ceiling, and it may be a ceiling that is in fact coming down. Whereas Biden doesn't have that ceiling in place. It seems to me the big question in this election is going to be if there's a third party candidate, and if so, how much of Biden's potential vote do they siphon off? Now, I want to conclude today by returning to this question of whether or not Donald Trump will be able to maintain his credibility in the process of defending himself in multiple simultaneous criminal trials. And here I want to suggest that Donald Trump's hallmark, both as a businessman and especially as a politician, is what I'm going to call a post-truth stance. He starts from the position that all of this stuff that experts and academics and journalists tell you, it's all fake, and he knows better. Trust me. So dismissal of our system for establishing knowledge and truth. He then suggests that he provides an alternative, personal, charismatic way of vouchsafing his claims. Trust me, because I'm the only one who stands up for you in a system that is rigged against you, right? And so the unfairness of the American economy, the changes in our culture, the diversification of our society, that all threatens a lot of people. A whole bunch of experts are saying this is what justice demands or what the market produces, and therefore it's fair. And Trump is saying, no, don't believe them, believe me. He suggests that he's a genius, that he can rely on his gut, his instinct, and his hunch, and in particular, that he can impose his will on the world. You don't need to use your understanding. You don't need to use your reason. You don't need to gather information. You don't need to listen to experts. He was famous while in the White House for essentially not listening to his intelligence briefings because he believes if he does not like what he's learning about the world, then he can remake the world to conform to his will. Power and authority, not knowledge and verifiability, make the truth. Trump has his truth and he wants to impose it on the world, the rest of us. He doesn't like the fact that he lost the election to Joe Biden. He's going to obliterate the factual evidence that that is the case and replace it with an alternative reality of his making and to his and his supporters like. And indifference to the truth has been a hallmark of Trump as a business person as well as a president. So I want to conclude today by saying that the absolute last place in the world that Trump wants to be is in a court of law being cross-examined by Jack Smith and his team, because this is the one place where the post-truth stance does not succeed and is revealed in nakedness as being what it is, right? That being cross-examined will expose the fact that he has lied and lied and lied and lied throughout his life and career, and that it will put him in a very difficult double bind. He will either have to own the fact that he willfully and repeatedly lied in order to defraud the American people, or he will be forced to acknowledge or at least be revealed as someone who is deeply delusional and believes only what suits his own interests. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into this today. I just want to briefly alert you to what helps Donald Trump sustain his post-truth world. And that is two major institutions: the Republican Party itself, which has become no longer Lincoln's party, but a link in a propaganda feedback loop. This is how many Republicans said after the first indictment that they wanted to see the indictment before making up their mind, as opposed to the number of Republicans who said they absolutely rejected the veracity of the indictment or its legitimacy without having seen it, right? This stands in contrast to the Republican Party's stance with regards to Richard Nixon. This is the number of Republicans who denied that the 2020 election had been correctly decided while running for office in 2022. As you can see, it's a majority of the Republican candidates. And by the way, they paid a price with the electorate. And this is one thing I want to say. Donald Trump does not simply get away with lying because he's such an effective and charismatic liar. He gets away with lying because major American institutions make his lies credible, amplify them, reinforce them, create almost sealed universe of mistruth. One of the central institutions of this propaganda feedback loop is the Republican Party. And it is beginning, I think, to show and to suffer the difficulty in sustaining lies over the long term. The most vociferous and aggressive election deniers were the people who did least well in contested districts in the 2022 elections. And they were dragged down by their post-truth stance. The other major institution that amplifies and gives credibility to Donald Trump's lies is the American media system. This is not only Fox News, this is a whole array of news outlets, both broadcast news, newspapers, and in particular social media websites. But having said all of that, at least Fox News, it appears, is beginning also to pay the cost of ongoing broadcasting of disinformation. It has settled its defamation suit with Dominion for over $700 million. And there are two more major defamation lawsuits making their way through the court system now. Whether this is enough to put a dent in Rupert Murdoch's profits, to make Fox change its tune, I don't know. But I think at least it's a hopeful sign that the American judiciary is holding to account institutions that repeatedly broadcast disinformation. And so, again, I think there's some reason to believe that what's happening in our legal system right now, although it's going to be incredibly difficult and destructive while we go through it, may be ultimately salutary for the future of American democracy. I'll stop there for today. I know I threw a lot at you. Thank you for letting me go the whole time. What questions, comments, thoughts do you have at this point? Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I just wondered about your thoughts about televising the proceedings in court.
My thoughts probably don't matter. And so, there's part of me that likes the idea that this is still a 19th century institution or an 18th century institution, that we don't bring cameras into the federal courts and that we have quaint drawings and have to read what happens. I think that that's a better functioning public sphere when we actually don't see the video or the outtake from the video, the soundbite, which can be easily manipulated. But having said that, probably in the 21st century, I'm just being old-fashioned, and we probably need video evidence of what transpired to most effectively allow it to disseminate in the public sphere and to do its work. Having said that, it's unclear to me. I didn't read this morning, but last time I read about it, it looked like it was going to be up to each of the circuits whether they would let cameras into their courts. But there was some question about whether or not perhaps John Roberts, the Chief Justice, in his administrative capacity, right? The Chief Justice of the United States is the administrator of the federal courts, in addition to being the Chief Justice, might just decide the issue. And so we'll have to see. But I think we should be ready for the idea that cameras won't be in the court, and not only ready for it, ready to perhaps take advantage of it as being a moment where the most important and interesting thing happening in our public sphere is something that we can't get a 20-second video clip of. That might not be an altogether bad thing. Thank you, Bob.
Well, it also seems to me that without having that, it's subject to so much more misinterpretation, misinformation about what goes on. People can take one little bite of what went on and blow it up. And if you have a recording of the entire thing, it seems a lot less easy to do that.
So let me ask a question, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just curious. People here today have read the indictment. So, that's, I think, revealing of the fact that very few of us are going to do the work of watching the whole thing, right? Some people do watch court TV and do it kind of for drama or for the soap operatic dimension of it. And maybe, I was thinking in the shower about if I were on Twitter, what I might tweet, or I guess we call it X these days. Will Donald Trump be the next OJ? right? And both in the sense that who knows, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he ultimately is facing jail, that he would try to become a fugitive. Maybe Putin would welcome him to Moscow. But in addition to that, would he become the trial of the century that captivates everybody's attention? We stop doing our work in order to watch the trial. Maybe. But having said that, I think, frankly, a lot of people are going to get their news from Fox News. It's the most watched news station in the country. And it's shown already with the congressional hearings that it's unwilling to broadcast things that are damaging to Donald Trump because that erodes its market share. So even if there are cameras in the courtroom, Bob, I think what you're worrying about is still going to occur, which is, call it a third, call it a quarter. I'm not quite sure, but a substantial portion of the American electorate is indifferent to what occurs in the courtroom. Their mind made up that Donald Trump is the only person in the United States for the last, let's say, 50 years who has stood up for people like them. And now he's just being persecuted because the entire establishment is stacked and rigged against people like that. And so I don't think we can change that environment just by getting the details of this trial out. If you want to change that environment, you got to actually fix the economy, fix college admissions and access to education in a knowledge economy. We keep going. I've given a whole bunch of lectures about these topics, right? But we need to make America fair again if we don't want people to just identify with Donald Trump as their champion no matter what. Sorry, got up on my soapbox for a moment, Bob, but
It's
that
okay.
I think we got to bear that in mind, that there's a reason that people believe Donald Trump, and it's not because they're confused. They've got the wool pulled over their eyes. It's because he connects with them. He feels their pain and he's angry about the same things they're angry about. And nobody else has convinced them that they are going to take their side.
Well, I don't think he's going to have a soapbox to stand on in the court trials. Basically he has to speak through his lawyers, and I don't think his lawyers are going to be making those sorts of arguments.
And if they do, they're going to be, quickly gavelled back into order, right? And
Right.
and by the way, there's the $50 million question here. Will Donald Trump testify on his own behalf in these trials? Because a lot of this is going to go to his state of mind. And it's very difficult to establish his state of mind without him testifying. I see you saying, no, he won't. Are you a lawyer, Bob? I don't know.
No, not even close.
Probably most lawyers would tell him not to testify, right? That's a trap. But remember who we're dealing with, right? This is a man who has a hard time attracting competent legal counsel because he doesn't do what his lawyers tell him to do, who is convinced that he's smarter than everybody else in the room, and who ultimately thinks he wins in the court of public opinion, even if he loses in the court of law. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he does end up testifying.
Well, that would be fun.
That would be something to tune in for, right? Good, Bob. Anybody else with a thought or question today? All right, everyone. I don't know if this is to be continued immediately or if we can go back to where we were thinking about thinking and talking about philosophy. Wouldn't that be nice? But I didn't want to just neglect this extremely important topic. I did want to talk with you about it today. Please take care. Be well, and I'll see everybody next week. Thanks so much. Bye,
Thank
guys.
you, David.